new interests and activities were now warning of the dangers of overexertion. Harkonnen finally added his voice to theirs. "You take it easy, Lucas." They had dropped formality and were on a first-name basis now. "You got hulled pretty badly. You let damage control work on you, and don't strain the machinery till it's fixed. We have plenty of time. We're not going to get anywhere chasing Dunnan. The only way we can catch him is by interception. The longer he moves around in the old Federation before he hears we're after him, the more of a trail he'll leave. Once we can establish a predictable pattern, we'll have a chance. Then, sometime, he'll come out of hyperspace somewhere and find us waiting for him." "Do you think he went to Tanith?" Harkonnen heaved himself out of his chair and prowled about the room for a few minutes. Then he came back and sat down again. "No. That was Duke Angus' idea, not his. He couldn't put in a base on Tanith anyhow. You know the kind of a crew he has." There had been an extensive inquiry into Dunnan's associates and accomplices. Duke Angus was still hoping for positive proof to implicate Omfrey of Glaspith in the piracy. Dunnan had with him 12 employees of the Gorham shipyards, whom he had corrupted. There was some technical ability among them, but for the most part they were agitators and troublemakers, and incompetent workmen. Even under the circumstances, Alex Gorham was glad to see the last of them. As for Dunnan's own mercenary company, there were about a score of former spacemen among them, the rest graded down from bandits through thugs and sneak thieves to barroom bums. Dunnan himself was an astrogator, not an engineer. "That gang aren't even good enough for routine raiding," Harkonnen said. "They'd never under any circumstances be able to put a base on Tanith. Unless Dunnan's completely crazy, which I doubt, he's gone to some regular Viking base planet, like Hoth, or Nergal, or Dagon, or Zoxchill, to recruit officers and engineers and able spacemen." "All that machinery and robotic equipment and so on that was going to Tanith, was that aboard when he took the ship?" "Yes, and that's another reason why he'd go to some planet like Hoth or Nergal or Zoxchill. On a Viking-occupied planet in the old Federation, that stuff's almost worth its weight in gold." "What's Tanith like?" "Almost completely Terra-type, third of a Class G sun. Very much like Halteclear or Flamberge. It was one of the last planets the Federation colonized before the Big War. Nobody knows what happened exactly. There wasn't any interstellar war. At least, you don't find any big slag puddles where cities used to be. They probably did a lot of fighting among themselves after they got out of the Federation. There's still some traces of combat damage around. Then they started to decivilize, down to the pre-mechanical level, wind and water power and animal power. They have draft animals that look like introduced Terran carabaos, and a few small sailboats and big canoes and bateaux on the rivers. They have gunpowder, which seems to be the last thing any people lose. I was there 5 years ago. I'd like Tanith for a base. There's one moon, almost solid nickel iron, and fissionable ore deposits. Then, like a fool, I hired out to the Elmersons on Durendal and lost my ship. When I came here, your Duke was thinking about Zipototech. I convinced him that Tanith was a better planet for his purpose." "Dunnan might go there at that. He might think he was scoring one on Duke Angus. After all, he has all that equipment. And nobody to use it. If I were Dunnan, I'd go to Nergal or Zochitl. There are always a couple of thousand space Vikings on either, spending their loot and taking it easy between raids. He could sign on a full crew on either. I suggest we go to Zochitl first. We might pick up news of him, if nothing else." All right, they'd try Zochitl first. Harkonnen knew the planet, and was friendly with the Halteclear noble who ruled it. The work went on at the Gorham shipyard. It had taken a year to build the Enterprise, but the steel mills and engine works were over the preparatory work of tooling up, and material and equipment was flowing in a steady stream. Lucas let him persuade him to take more rest, and day by day grew stronger. Soon he was spending most of his time at the shipyard, watching the engines go in, Abbott lift and drive for normal space, Dillingham hyperdrive, power converters, pseudograv, all at the center of the globular ship. Living quarters and workshops went in next, all armored in collapsium-plated steel. Then the ship lifted out to an orbit 1,000 miles off planet, followed by swarms of armored work craft and cargo lighters. The rest of the work was more easily done in space. At the same time, the 4 200-foot pinnaces that would be carried aboard were being finished. Each of them had its own hyperdrive engines and could travel as far and as fast as the ship herself. Otto Harkeman was beginning to be distressed because the ship still lacked a name. He didn't like having to speak of her as her, or the ship, and there were many things soon to go on that should be name-marked. Elaine, Trask thought at once, and almost at once rejected it. He didn't want her name associated with the things that ship would do in the old Federation. Revenge, Avenger, Retribution, Vendetta. None appealed to him. A news commentator, turgidly eloquent about the nemesis which the criminal Dunnan had invoked against himself, supplied it. Nemesis it was. Now he was studying his new profession of interstellar robbery and murder, against which he had once inveighed. Otto Harkeman's handful of followers became his teachers. Van Larch, Guns and Missiles, who was also a painter. Gwat Kirby, sour and pessimistic, the hyperspatial astrogator who tried to express his science in music. Charles Renner, the normal space astrogator. Alvin Carford, the exec, who had been with Harkeman longest of all. And Sir Patrick Morland, a local recruit, formerly guard captain to Count Lionel of New Haven, who commanded the ground fighters and the combat contragravity. They were using the farms and villages of Traskin for drill and practice, and he noticed that while the Nemesis would carry only 500 ground and air fighters, over 1,000 were being trained. He commented to Rovard Groffus. "Yes, don't mention it outside," the Duke's henchman said. "You and Sir Patrick and Captain Harkeman will pick the 500 best. The Duke will take the rest into his service. Some of these days, Omfrey of Glaspeth will find out what a space Viking raid is really like." And Duke Angus would take his new subjects of Glaspeth to redeem the pledges on his new barony of Traskin. Some old pre-atomic writer Harkeman was fond of quoting had said, "Gold will not always get you good soldiers, but good soldiers can get you gold." The Nemesis came back to the Gorham yards and settled onto her curved landing legs like a monstrous spider. The Enterprise had borne the Ward, Sword and Atom symbol. The Nemesis should bear his own badge. But the bisonoid head, tawny on green, of Traskin was no longer his. He chose a skull impaled on an upright sword, and it was blazoned on the ship when he and Harkeman took her out for her shakedown cruise. When they landed again at the Gorham yards, 200 hours later, they learned that a tramp freighter from Morglay had come into Biglersport in their absence with news of Andre Dunnan. Her captain had come to Wardshaven at Duke Angus' urgent invitation, and was waiting for them at the ducal palace. They sat, a dozen of them, around a table at the Duke's private apartments. The freighter captain, a small, precise man with a graying beard, alternately puffed at a cigarette and sipped from a beaker of brandy. "I spaced out from Morglay 200 hours ago," he was saying. "I'd been there 12 local days, 300 galactic standard hours, and the run from Cortana was 320.